The beeping was the only sound I remember. Not voices, not footsteps, just that steady, mechanical beeping that tells you someone is keeping track of whether you're still alive because apparently no one else is. My name is Margaret. I'm 67 years old. I live in a small house in Barrie, Ontario, about an hour and a half north of Toronto. I spent 34 years teaching elementary school, raised one child mostly on my own after my husband Raymond passed from a stroke when our son was only 9, and I have spent the better part of the last decade telling myself that the distance between my son and me was just a phase. That he was busy. That things would get better. I was wrong, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started on a Tuesday morning in November, when I went downstairs to make my coffee and my left knee gave out on the last step. I didn't fall dramatically. It wasn't like the movies. I just sat down, hard, on the bottom stair, and I knew immediately that something was very wrong. The pain shot up through my hip and into my lower back, and when I tried to stand, my leg wouldn't cooperate. I managed to pull myself to the kitchen floor and reach my phone from the counter edge, and that's where I stayed. I called my son first. Of course I did. He didn't answer. I called again. Nothing. I called my neighbor Helen, a woman in her 70s who lives 2 doors down and who has always been the kind of person who notices when your porch light doesn't come on. She answered on the second ring, came over within 4 minutes with her spare key, and had 911 on the phone before she even walked through my door. The paramedics told me I had a fractured hip, the kind that, in women my age, often signals the beginning of a longer decline if not treated properly. I needed surgery. I needed it that day. At the hospital, the intake nurse asked me for my emergency contact. I gave her my son's name and number. His name is Derek. He's 38 years old, works in finance in downtown Toronto, and lives in a condo in Liberty Village with his girlfriend and their 2 dogs. The nurse called him while they were prepping me for surgery. He didn't answer. She tried again an hour later, when I was coming out of anesthesia. He didn't answer. By the time I was moved to a recovery room and fully conscious, the nurse had called Derek's number 14 times. 14 times between the moment I arrived at the hospital and the moment I opened my eyes in a room that smelled like antiseptic and someone else's flowers. 14 calls over the course of an entire afternoon and evening. Not one answer, not one voicemail returned. I remember lying there and looking at the ceiling tiles and thinking, he'll call back. He's probably in a meeting. He's probably on a deadline. He works hard. He's busy. There are 1,000 reasons a person might miss a call. I counted ceiling tiles instead of thinking about the silence on my phone. The next morning, the nurse, a young woman named Priya, who had the kind of steady, quiet competence that makes you feel like the world might still be okay, came in to check on me. She asked, gently, whether my son had been in touch. I said I was sure he would be soon. She nodded the way people nod when they're being kind and they know something you're not ready to hear yet. That afternoon, Helen came. She brought my good cardigan, a thermos of her homemade tomato soup, and the novel I'd been reading, All Things I Hadn't Asked For, All Things I Needed. She sat beside my bed for 3 hours. She held my hand during the part where the physiotherapist came to explain what the next 6 weeks would look like. She asked the questions I was too tired to ask. She wrote everything down in a small notebook she pulled from her coat pocket. Derek still hadn't called. On the second day, I finally picked up my phone and opened the messaging app myself. Not to write to Derek, just to look, just to see. His last message to me was from 3 weeks earlier, a one-line response to a photo I'd sent of my backyard in the first snow. Nice. I scrolled back further. Our last actual conversation, the kind where more than 4 words were exchanged, was in August, when I'd mentioned I was thinking of selling the house and moving somewhere smaller. He'd been very interested in that conversation, very engaged. He'd asked about the property value, about what the market was doing in Barrie, about whether I'd spoken to a real estate agent yet. That was the most we'd talked in months. I put my phone face down on the blanket and looked out the window at the gray November sky, and I let myself feel it, really feel it for the first time, the thing I'd been explaining away for years. The careful pattern of availability that only appeared when something of mine was on the table. On the third day, Helen brought her granddaughter with her. a young woman named Sophie, 24 years old, studying nursing at Georgian College right there in Barrie. Sophie was doing a placement rotation and had some flexibility in her schedule, and she offered completely on her own, without being asked to come by the hospital each morning before her placement shift to help me with breakfast and to sit with me while the physiotherapist came. She didn't know me well. She'd met me maybe a handful of times over the years at Helen's house. But she showed up with a warm, matter-of-fact kindness that didn't ask anything of me, didn't need me to perform gratitude or explain my situation or justify why my son wasn't there. She just came. On the morning of the fourth day, while Sophie was helping me practice standing with the walker, my phone lit up on the bedside table. It was Derek. Not a call, a text. "Mom, just heard from Gran Helen that you were in the hospital. Hope you're okay. Been super slammed at work. Call me when you can." I read it twice. Then I put the phone back down. Sophie glanced at the screen, then at my face, and said nothing. She just steadied the walker and said, "Okay, let's try 3 steps today instead of 2. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not anger, I want to be clear about that. I have never been an angry person. Raymond always said my greatest strength and my greatest flaw were the same thing. I forgive too easily and too fast. But this wasn't anger. This was something quieter. Something that felt like clarity. I had been in the hospital for 4 days. My son had heard from my neighbor, not from the hospital, not from me, from my 70-year-old neighbor. And his response was a text message that said he'd been slammed at work. I did not call him back. Not that day. Not the next. The physio team said I'd need at least 5 more days in hospital before I could go home, and then 6 weeks of very limited mobility, with someone checking on me daily. I had stairs in my house. I had a bathroom on the 2nd floor. I had a kitchen that required standing. Helen, without being asked, organized a schedule. She and 2 other women from the neighborhood, Carol from across the street, and a retired nurse named Beverly from the end of the block set up a rotation. Someone would be at my house every morning and every evening for the first 2 weeks. They bought a shower chair. They rearranged my main floor so I could sleep in the living room on the pull-out couch without touching the stairs. They stocked my fridge. My son, meanwhile, sent 2 more texts over that same period. One said, "How's recovery going?" The other said, "Let me know if you need anything." I read both. I responded to neither. I know that sounds cold. I know some people reading this might think, "Margaret," he reached out. He asked, "Isn't that something?" And maybe once I would have agreed. Maybe once I would have called him back within the hour, told him everything was fine, told him not to worry, made it easy for him. I was very good at making things easy for Derek. I had been making things easy for Derek for 38 years. But I was lying in a hospital bed with a fractured hip, and my neighbor's granddaughter was helping me brush my teeth, and my son had sent me a text that said, "Let me know if you need anything," and I thought, I did let you know. The hospital let you know 14 times. You didn't answer. So I didn't call. On the day I was discharged, Helen picked me up. Sophie came too, sitting in the back seat, holding the bag of medications the hospital sent home with me. We stopped at the pharmacy on Dunlop Street, and then Helen made me a proper lunch at my own kitchen table. And then the 2 of them helped me get settled into my makeshift main floor bedroom. And it was, I want to say this plainly, it was one of the most genuinely cared for I had felt in years. That evening, alone for the first time since the fall, I sat in the armchair by the front window with a cup of tea, and I thought about the house. I had been thinking about selling it since the summer. It was too big for one person. The stairs were becoming a problem even before the hip. I'd been ignoring that. The property had gone up substantially in value. I'd bought it in 1997 for $180,000, and the current estimate, according to a casual conversation with a realtor at a neighborhood garage sale, was somewhere around $640,000. After paying out the remaining line of credit I'd used for some repairs, I was looking at roughly $580,000 clear. I had been waiting to decide, telling myself I'd figure it out in the spring, telling myself there was no rush. But lying in that hospital bed, I'd had a lot of time to think, and somewhere around day 3, the day before Derek's text arrived, I'd made a decision. I called a lawyer. Her name was Patricia, and I'd used her years ago for Raymond's estate. She was sharp, No nonsense. The kind of woman who gets things done without requiring you to explain your feelings. I told her I wanted to update my will and also begin the process of listing the house. She scheduled a meeting for the following week, right at my kitchen table because I couldn't drive yet. I did not mention any of this to Derek. Over the following 3 weeks, I made a lot of decisions very quietly. The house went on the market in early December, a quieter time, but the Barrie market had been consistent, and my realtor, a calm and efficient man named David, said we'd likely have interest within 2 weeks. He was right. We had an offer within 10 days. I accepted it. Closing was set for late February, which gave me time to find a 1-bedroom plus den in a newer building on the south end of town, ground floor, no stairs, in-unit laundry, a small patio that looked out onto a courtyard with a big maple tree. I put a deposit down on the condo in the second week of December. I updated my will with Patricia. I won't go into every detail, but I will say that I thought very carefully about what I wanted my legacy to mean, not as punishment, not out of bitterness, but out of honesty. An honest accounting of who had shown up, who had been present, who had treated my life as though it mattered. I left a meaningful portion to Helen, to be used however she wished. I set up a small education fund in Sophie's name, enough to help with the last year of her nursing degree and any certification costs after. I made a donation to the palliative care unit at the hospital where I'd recovered, because the nurses there had been extraordinary. I arranged for my remaining assets to go into a trust that would support me through retirement and, after that, to a combination of causes I believe in. Derek was included in the will. I am his mother, and I am not a cruel person. But the inclusion was modest and honest, and it reflected, as Patricia helped me articulate, the relationship as it had actually existed, not the relationship I had hoped for. I did not tell Derek about any of it. Christmas came. Derek called on Christmas Eve, an actual phone call, which I will give him credit for. He was cheerful, distracted, mentioned they were heading to his girlfriend's family in Muskoka for a few days. He asked how the hip was coming along. He did not ask about the hospital stay. He did not mention the 14 unanswered calls, or the texts I hadn't responded to, or the 4 days I'd spent alone in a recovery room. He talked for about 9 minutes, and then said he'd try to come up to Barrie in the new year, maybe in February, and I said that sounded fine. I did not mention that I would no longer be in Barrie in February. January was quiet and purposeful. Helen and Carol helped me sort through the house, 26 years of accumulated life, carefully and honestly organized. Some things went to the women's shelter on Dunlop. Some things went to the thrift shop near the library. Some things I packed into the boxes that would come with me to the new place. Raymond's hockey memorabilia, a collection he'd spent years building, I donated to the local arena, where it would be displayed in the lobby. That felt right. I found, while sorting through the study, a box of old-school photos from my teaching years. 34 years of class photos, all neatly labeled. Hundreds of children who had sat in my classroom and learned to read and write and treat each other with some basic decency. I sat on the floor of the study for a long time with that box. I had given a great deal of myself to a great many people. I was not a person who had nothing to show for her life. I wanted to remember that. I moved into the new condo on a Friday in late February. Helen and Sophie helped. Carol's husband Robert drove the furniture truck. Beverly brought a plant for the patio and a bottle of sparkling cider, and we sat in my new living room on moving boxes and drank it out of paper cups, and it was one of the happiest evenings I can remember in a long time. The house sale closed the following Monday. On the Wednesday of that same week, Derek called. His voice was different. Not cheerful. Tighter. He'd apparently called the old house number first, the landline I'd had transferred, and then the cell. "Mom," he said, "I drove up to Barrie today. I went to the house. I waited. There's a sold sticker on the sign," he said, "and the lights are off. And the neighbor, not Helen, the one on the other side, said you moved out last week." "That's right," I said. A pause. "Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about that question for a moment. I thought about 14 phone calls. I thought about a text that said "been super slammed at work." I thought about 9 minutes on Christmas Eve. "I didn't think you'd want to know," I said. "You seemed very busy." "Mom, Selling the house is a big deal. Where are you living? What happened to everything? What about—" He stopped. Then, more carefully, "What about the sale proceeds?" And there it was. The question that clarified everything that needed clarifying. "I'm well taken care of," I said. "You don't need to worry about me." "Mom, we should talk about this properly, in person. Can I come see you? Where are you?" "I'm settling in," I said. "Give me a few weeks." He called 3 more times that week. I let the calls go to voicemail and listened to each one. They progressed, I'll say that for him. The first was tight and controlled and asked a lot of logistical questions about the house and the money. The second was more personal, said he felt left out, said he wished I had told him what was going on. The third was quieter, and he said he was sorry he hadn't come to see me in the hospital, that he should have, that he didn't have a good excuse. That third voicemail I listened to twice. I am not writing this story to say that my son is a bad person. I don't believe that. I believe he is a person who learned over many years that I would always be there, that I would answer, that I would forgive, that I would make it easy, that there would always be time later. He learned that because I taught it to him. I take some responsibility for that. But I am 67 years old. I had a fractured hip and I spent 4 days in a hospital bed, and the people who showed up were my neighbor, her granddaughter, and 2 women from my street who barely knew me well enough to know my coffee order. The people who show up, that's family. That's what I know now. It's April now. The maple tree in the courtyard outside my patio has started to bud. I have a Saturday morning routine: coffee at the kitchen table, newspaper, then a slow walk around the courtyard with my cane. The hip is much better. The physiotherapist is very pleased with my progress. Helen comes for lunch most Sundays. Sophie has 3 months left in her program, and she comes by on Thursday evenings sometimes, and we watch a nature documentary and eat whatever I've cooked too much of during the week. Derek and I have had 2 proper conversations since February. They were honest conversations, more honest than anything we'd managed in years, probably because I stopped performing reassurance and he stopped performing busyness, and we just talked, carefully, about what had happened and why. It was uncomfortable. I think it needed to be. I don't know where that relationship goes from here. I hope toward something real. But I'm not waiting for it to get better before I start living. That's the other thing I decided somewhere around day 3 in that hospital bed. I kept the proceeds from the house. I have a comfortable, manageable retirement. I have a patio with a maple tree and neighbors who knock on the door, and good friends who bring tomato soup in a thermos, and a young woman who is going to be a very fine nurse. I have, for the first time in a long time, a life that feels like mine. And the silence I kept for all those weeks, the calls I didn't return, the texts I didn't answer, that wasn't cruelty, it wasn't revenge. It was just me, finally, giving myself the same grace I had always given everyone else. It turns out that's enough. It turns out that's quite a lot, actually.